In the Italian theater of 1943, infantry doctrine entered terrain that compressed distance, visibility, and reaction time into margins far narrower than those assumed by Allied marksmanship training manuals written for North Africa or continental Europe. Engagement ranges collapsed from doctrinal expectations of 300 to 500 m to irregular windows, often below 120 m, shaped by stone terraces, olive groves, and ruined masonry that absorbed sound and fragmented sightlines. Standard rifle instruction, centered on calibrated iron sights set for 200-yard zero and deliberate fire cadence, assumed time to align, breathe, and correct. Italy removed that time. What replaced it was not improvisation for its own sake, but adaptation driven by geometry. The U.S. infantry rifle in this environment was the M1 Garand, chambered in .30-06 Springfield, firing a 150 GR projectile at approximately 2,800 feet per second from a 610 mm barrel. Its rear aperture sight, designed for precision at medium range, required visual alignment that consumed fractions of a second, which no longer existed once contact occurred inside vineyards or stair-stepped villages. German defenders, equipped primarily with Carabiner 98K rifles firing 7.92 by 57 mm, exploited this delay by firing from partial cover at angles that forced snap engagement rather than aimed fire. The problem was not accuracy. It was acquisition time. By late 1943, several U.S. riflemen and NCOs began altering sight usage without modifying the weapon itself. The rear aperture was ignored entirely. The rifle was indexed by receiver geometry, front sight mass, and muscle memory, effectively converting the Garand into a point index system optimized for 50 to 100 m. This was not taught. It emerged under fire. The technical anchor was visual processing speed. Human eye, brain alignment under stress operated faster when one reference plane was removed. Accuracy degraded beyond 150 m, but inside 100 m hit probability increased measurably, especially during the first 2 to 3 s of contact. Field reports from units engaged during the advance north of Salerno and later along the Gustav Line describe engagements resolved before formal fire commands were issued. Squads entering contact zones triggered by MG positions, often MG-34 or MG-42 firing at 800 to 1,200 revolutions per minute, could not afford the delay imposed by textbook sight alignment. The suppression envelope created by German machine guns forced American riflemen into immediate response or forced withdrawal. In this context, a wrong sight picture became a functional solution, not because it was superior in theory, but because it matched the time constants imposed by terrain and enemy fire. The Army did not codify this method. Training circulars remained unchanged through 1944, emphasizing controlled fire and sight discipline. Yet after-action reports increasingly reflected casualty distributions inconsistent with doctrinal assumptions. Engagements were ending faster. Ammunition expenditure per contact decreased at short range, while initial volley effectiveness increased. These were not statistical anomalies, but indicators of a procedural shift occurring below the level of formal doctrine. The system was learning, but informally. As operations moved toward Rome and later into northern Italy, the environment continued to enforce these constraints. Stone villages reduced effective lines of sight to single streets measuring 30 to 60 m. Reaction time, not ballistic performance, determined survival. The Garand semi-automatic action allowed rapid follow-up shots, but only if the first shot arrived before the enemy completed his own firing cycle. Removing the rear sight from the cognitive loop shortened that cycle. It was not elegant. It was sufficient. By 1944, Allied forces compensated at the system level rather than the individual one. Increased use of submachine guns, such as the M1A1 Thompson and M3, firing .45 ACP at lower velocity but higher controllability in confined space, reduced reliance on rifle snap fire altogether. Artillery coordination tightened. Mortar support, using 60 mm and 81 mm systems, preempted close contact zones. The conditions that had made the sight trick effective were gradually removed, not by adopting it, but by overwhelming it with organizational solutions. What occurred in Italy was not a revolution in marksmanship, but a diagnostic moment. A temporary mismatch between doctrine and environment allowed a technically incorrect method to outperform standardized training within a narrow envelope of distance and time. Once that mismatch closed, the method lost relevance. The system absorbed the lesson without preserving the anomaly, reinforcing a broader pattern of industrial war. Individual adaptations matter only until the structure adjusts, after which they disappear, having served their purpose without ever being formally acknowledged. The persistence of this gap between formal doctrine and battlefield behavior was not accidental. U.S. infantry training pipelines in 1942 to 1943 were constrained by throughput, not refinement. Replacement depots processed thousands of riflemen on compressed schedules measured in weeks, not months, prioritizing weapon familiarity and basic safety over environmental adaptation. The sighting method remained standardized because standardization reduced training variance, not because it optimized lethality in every terrain. Italy exposed the cost of that assumption. German doctrine approached the problem from the opposite direction. The Heeresdienstvorschrift 132A emphasized fire distribution and reaction speed at the squad level, subordinating individual marksmanship to immediate suppression. In Italian hill towns, German riflemen using the Carabiner 98K did not attempt rapid target acquisition under surprise contact. They fired from prepared angles, often coordinated with machine gun coverage, forcing the attacker into a compressed decision loop. The technical limiter was not weapon accuracy, but the attacker's time to first effective shot, typically under 1.5 s once contact was initiated. This asymmetry explains why the improvised American method briefly worked. By bypassing the rear aperture, riflemen reduced alignment time by approximately 0.3 to 0.5 s, a marginal gain that became decisive inside confined geometry. That margin existed only because German positions assumed doctrinal American behavior. Once firing patterns shifted, that assumption weakened. German defenders adjusted by increasing depth rather than speed, layering positions so that first contact no longer decided the engagement. The U.S. response did not come as an explicit correction to rifle technique. Instead, it manifested through organizational weight. By early 1944, infantry companies in Italy operated with higher ratios of automatic weapons per platoon than those envisioned in 1941 tables of organization. The presence of Bar M 1918A2, firing .30-06 at cyclic rates of 500 to 650 revolutions per minute, altered the opening seconds of contact. Suppression was achieved without requiring precise individual sight alignment, effectively bypassing the original problem rather than solving it. Terrain analysis reinforced this shift. After-action terrain studies conducted following the Anzio landings demonstrated that average engagement duration in urban or terraced environments rarely exceeded 90 s before either withdrawal or external fire support intervened. Within such windows, doctrinal marksmanship variables, zero distance, windage correction, deliberate cadence, had negligible impact. What mattered was who imposed disruption first. The rifle remained relevant, but no longer decisive on its own. By mid-1944, the improvised sight method disappeared from reports, not because it was disproven, but because the system no longer required it. The battlefield had been reshaped by mass, coordination, and layered firepower. The anomaly had revealed a flaw, and once that flaw was compensated for at scale, the individual workaround lost significance. The war moved on, absorbing the lesson without recording it, leaving behind only indirect traces in casualty curves, ammunition expenditure, and revised force composition. That absorption was measurable. Ammunition expenditure reports from 5th Army units operating south of Rome in May, June 1940 show a marked shift in ratios. Rifle ammunition consumption per confirmed engagement declined, while belt-fed and magazine-fed automatic fire increased disproportionately. This was not a change in accuracy. It was a redistribution of responsibility. The system reassigned the task of forcing reaction away from the individual rifleman and onto weapons designed to dominate time, not space. Training documents lagged behind practice. Field manuals issued in 1943 continued to describe deliberate sight alignment and controlled fire as normative, even as combat units deviated under pressure. The contradiction persisted because doctrine prioritized reproducibility over optimization. A technique that relied on informal modification could not be standardized across replacement flows that rotated personnel every 60 to 90 days. The technical constraint was organizational memory. Units changed faster than manuals could adapt. German forces encountered a similar transition from the opposite direction. losses in Italy forced reductions in experienced NCO cadres by late 1944, degrading the effectiveness of prepared fire geometry. Without consistent squad leaders to manage arcs and timing, the advantage of prearranged angles diminished. Under those conditions, German riflemen increasingly relied on volume rather than placement. Mirroring the Allied shift, the rifle on both sides became a secondary instrument within a broader fire system. Environmental factors compounded this convergence. Italian terrain imposed vertical separation rarely encountered in Northwest Europe. Engagements frequently involved elevation differences of 20 to 40 m over horizontal distances under 100 m, compressing ballistic trajectories and minimizing the benefits of calibrated zeroing. In such conditions, bullet drop was functionally irrelevant. What remained was reaction latency and exposure time. Any method that reduced the former, even informally, gained temporary relevance. By the time Allied forces crossed into the northern Apennines, the conditions that had allowed the improvised sight method to matter had largely vanished. Fire was no longer initiated by isolated riflemen encountering sudden contact, but by coordinated probes supported by indirect fire planning measured in grids and time-on-target calculations. The system had evolved past the point where a marginal gain of 0.3 s could alter outcomes at scale. What remains visible in the historical record is not the technique itself, but the pattern it exposed. War did not reward innovation in isolation. It rewarded compatibility with the system's dominant constraints: training throughput, terrain geometry, command latency, and the economics of ammunition. The rifleman's adjustment briefly intersected with those constraints, then was overtaken by larger structural adaptations that rendered it unnecessary without ever formally rejecting it. The larger implication becomes clearer when examined against the institutional data that followed. By late 1944, U.S. Army small arms evaluation reports no longer framed effectiveness around first-round hit probability. Instead, they emphasized time to suppress and probability of force displacement. These metrics aligned with weapons and methods that dominated reaction windows rather than precision envelopes. The rifle's iron sights, calibrated for deliberate fire at 300 yards, remained mechanically unchanged, but their doctrinal role had narrowed. The constraint was not mechanical capability, but relevance under compressed engagement timelines. This shift also explains why no formal prohibition or endorsement of the improvised sight method ever appeared. The system did not need to resolve the anomaly. It bypassed it. Replacement training centers continued to teach standard alignment because deviation introduced variance without offering systemic payoff. Any gain under 0.5 s was outweighed by the risk of inconsistent performance across thousands of new arrivals. Organizational scale converted a tactical curiosity into statistical noise. German records from Army Group C reflect a parallel recognition. After-action summaries from late 1944 increasingly describe Allied infantry attacks, not in terms of marksmanship quality, but in terms of Führerdienst, measured by volume per minute within defined sectors. The metric assumed suppression as the primary driver of maneuver success. Once that assumption dominated, individual sighting technique became operationally invisible. Both sides converged on the same conclusion without direct coordination. What distinguishes the Italian episode is not that it produced a lasting innovation, but that it revealed the boundary at which individual adaptation can influence outcomes before being absorbed or erased by system-level correction. The improvised sight method mattered only while the engagement geometry remained narrow, training pipelines rigid, and automatic weapon density insufficient. Once any one of those variables shifted, the window closed. In this sense, the episode functions less as a story of ingenuity than as a diagnostic trace. It exposes how armies learn without acknowledging learning, how doctrine lags practice until practice renders doctrine irrelevant, and how technical detail survives only when it scales. The rifleman's adjustment did not fail. It was simply overtaken by a war that no longer required it, leaving behind a brief distortion in the data before equilibrium reasserted itself under heavier, faster, and more impersonal systems of fire. That equilibrium was formalized only after the fact. Post-war analyses conducted by the U.S. Army Ground Forces in 1946 to 1947 retroactively categorized Italian infantry combat as an anomaly driven by terrain compression and force density. The conclusions avoided specific mention of sighting deviations, focusing instead on aggregate outcomes, casualty exchange ratios, rounds expended per advance, and average time to secure objectives. The rifleman's experience was translated into tables. Individual technique dissolved into averages. What the data showed was consistent. As automatic weapon density increased beyond 1.2 weapons per squad, the correlation between individual rifle proficiency and local success declined sharply. At that threshold, suppression probability within the first 2S of contact exceeded 70%, regardless of initial rifle alignment. The limiting factor shifted again, this time from reaction speed to ammunition logistics. Units that sustained fire longer, measured in minutes rather than seconds, dictated movement. The rifle became a filler between bursts, not the initiator of action. Italian operations also accelerated the institutional separation between training ideal and combat reality. Replacement riflemen arriving in 1944 were increasingly assigned roles where their primary function was to feed the fire system rather than dominate it. Ammunition carriers, security elements, and reserve shooters filled gaps created by machine guns and mortars. In that structure, deviations in sight picture offered no systemic advantage. The constraint was positional dependency. Firepower was effective only when synchronized. German defensive collapse in Italy further reinforced this trend. As fuel shortages and air interdiction reduced mobility, German units relied more heavily on static defense tied to limited resupply. Engagements became predictable in location but brief in execution. Under those conditions, the opening exchange mattered less than the ability to sustain or withdraw under pressure. The Allied advantage lay not in technique but in redundancy. Multiple overlapping systems ensured that no single failure or innovation could alter the outcome. The improvised sight method thus occupies a narrow tempo band in the record. It appears after contact density increased beyond training assumptions, but before automatic fire fully saturated the infantry fight. It disappears once that saturation was achieved. This pattern is not unique to Italy. Similar transient adaptations can be traced in other theaters, always bounded by the same variables: scale, throughput, and coordination. By examining the episode through those constraints, the narrative resolves without requiring heroism or dismissal. The method was neither foolish nor transformative. It was an artifact of a system under adjustment. When the adjustment completed, the artifact lost function. What endured was not the technique, but the lesson embedded in procurement, organization, and doctrine, visible only when viewed across time, numbers, and material flow rather than through individual accounts. That perspective clarifies why comparable adaptations surfaced independently and vanished without trace. British infantry reports from 8th Army units operating along the Adriatic coast in late 1943 note similar informal deviations from standard site usage during house-to-house clearing, yet none were formalized. The pattern number 4 MKI rifle, zeroed for 300 yards, offered no mechanical advantage in engagements occurring at 30 to 60 yards across stairwells and rubble. Like their American counterparts, British riflemen shortened their decision cycle by sacrificing precision margins that no longer mattered. The constraint was identical. Geometry collapsed distance faster than doctrine could respond. At the same time, ordnance engineers were already solving the problem at a different layer. Trials conducted in North Africa and Sicily fed directly into accelerated adoption of close-range fire solutions, simplified rear apertures, wider notches, and eventually reflex-style aiming concepts explored experimentally after 1944. None reached frontline deployment during the war, but their existence confirms that institutions recognized the mismatch. They addressed it through design and production timelines measured in years, while soldiers improvised in seconds. Italian combat thus occupies a transitional phase between two regimes. In the first, infantry combat assumed linear distance, stable sight pictures, and deliberate cadence. In the second, it assumed fragmentation, verticality, and suppression dominance. The improvised sight method existed only in the overlap. It was enabled by mechanical tolerances of existing rifles, by training rigidity that delayed adaptation, and by a temporary insufficiency of automatic fire. All three conditions were time-bound. Once artillery coordination and indirect fire planning matured, even suppression shifted upward. Time-on-target missions reduced the frequency of sudden, unplanned contact. Fire was initiated by map reference and clock synchronization rather than visual surprise. In that environment, the rifle's role contracted further. It became a maintenance tool of pressure, not a trigger of events. The earlier adjustment could not survive that transition because it addressed a problem that no longer defined the fight. What emerges from the full arc is a consistent pattern of wartime learning. Armies do not adopt techniques because they work locally. They adopt them when those techniques align with throughput, logistics, and command structure. Anything that cannot be replicated across thousands of men under variable conditions is filtered out, regardless of its short-term utility. The Italian rifle episode illustrates this filtering process in its raw form, visible only because it occurred during a moment of imbalance before system-level correction restored coherence. In that sense, the episode is less about marksmanship than about scale. It demonstrates how individual solutions are tolerated only while they compensate for systemic delay. Once the system catches up, through mass, coordination, or redesign, the solutions vanish, not because they failed, but because they are no longer necessary. That disappearance leaves behind a subtle but measurable residue in the archival record. When casualty distributions from Italian engagements are compared across 1943, early 1944, and late 1944, the variance narrows. Early actions show wider dispersion in small unit outcomes, consistent with local adaptations having disproportionate effect. Later actions converge toward predictable ratios governed by firepower density and support timing. The system stabilized. Variability declined. Individual technique lost statistical weight. This stabilization coincided with doctrinal recalibration that avoided explicit acknowledgement of the earlier gap. Revised infantry training syllabi issued in mid-1944 reduced emphasis on individual rifle scoring beyond 200 yards and increased time allocated to movement under fire, communication, and integration with automatic weapons. The rifle was still taught as a primary arm, but its employment was framed within collective action. The technical limiter was coordination latency. Effectiveness now depended on how quickly a squad could synchronize fire, not on how fast a single soldier could align sights. Material constraints reinforced this framing. Ammunition supply calculations for Italian operations prioritized sustained automatic fire, allocating higher tonnage per battalion than earlier Mediterranean campaigns. Rifles consumed what remained. This was not inefficiency. It reflected a deliberate choice to invest in systems that compressed enemy decision space. Under such conditions, any technique that optimized the first 0.5 s of individual engagement was functionally eclipsed by weapons that dominated the next 30 to 60 s. The German response further validates the interpretation. As Allied fire systems matured, German infantry increasingly relied on dispersed defense and elastic withdrawal rather than counterfire. Reports emphasize avoidance of prolonged contact rather than winning the opening exchange. The metric of success shifted from holding ground to delaying advance. In that framework, individual marksmanship became even less relevant. Survival depended on timing and concealment, not shot placement. Viewed longitudinally, the Italian rifle episode aligns with a broader wartime pattern. Temporary tactical innovations emerge where doctrine, material, and environment misalign. They persist only until the slowest of those elements adjusts. In Italy, environment forced the issue first, soldiers responded second, and organization adapted last. The lag between those phases created a narrow window where improvisation mattered. Once closed, the system resumed its dominant logic. Combat outcomes were again determined by the interplay of logistics, command, and fire support rather than by marginal changes in individual technique. The rifle remained present, unchanged in steel and wood, but transformed in function. It no longer defined the fight. It served it. What the episode ultimately reveals is not a failure of doctrine, but its inertia. Large systems cannot pivot on isolated evidence. They correct through accumulation, through shifts in aggregate performance that justify reallocation of resources. The improvised sight method contributed to that accumulation indirectly, by highlighting a mismatch that the system resolved at scale. When the resolution arrived, the method dissolved into the background noise of war, leaving no trace except in the numbers that quietly changed around it. That background noise is where most battlefield adaptation ultimately resides. It does not survive as doctrine or as named technique, but as a statistical drift that alters how future decisions are justified. By 1945, when U.S. infantry doctrine was reviewed against European combat data, the rifle was no longer evaluated primarily as an independent killing instrument. It was treated as one node within a fire network whose effectiveness depended on sequencing, overlap, and sustainment. The technical limiter had shifted again, this time to communications reliability and ammunition flow under movement. The earlier question of sight alignment speed no longer entered the equation. This evolution was reflected indirectly in equipment priorities. While no wartime redesign of the standard service rifle occurred, post-war development programs placed disproportionate emphasis on controllability and rapid target engagement at short range. The logic traced back through Italy without ever naming it. Designers assumed that future infantry combat would continue to compress distances and accelerate decision cycles. They optimized for tolerance rather than precision, accepting wider dispersion in exchange for faster engagement. The lesson was systemic, not tactical. Italian combat thus becomes intelligible only when framed as a transitional environment. It sat between the early war expectation of rifle-centric engagements and the late war reality of fire-dominated maneuver. The improvised sight method appeared precisely because the system had not yet fully adapted to its own constraints. It was a response to a temporary imbalance between training assumptions and battlefield geometry. Once that imbalance was corrected through massed fire and coordination, the response lost relevance. What matters is not whether the method worked, but why it was briefly necessary. It existed because standardization lagged behind reality, because training pipelines could not reconfigure quickly, and because material distribution had not yet saturated the infantry fight with automatic fire. These conditions converged in Italy in 1943, early 1944, and nowhere else with the same intensity. That convergence produced a narrow aperture through which individual adaptation could influence outcomes. As the aperture closed, influence migrated upward. Decisions that once depended on individual reaction speed became functions of platoon-level synchronization and battalion-level fire planning. The locus of control moved away from the rifleman. The war rewarded that shift because it reduced variance. Predictability, not ingenuity, became the dominant currency of effectiveness. In that sense, the episode does not challenge the logic of large-scale warfare. It confirms it. Systems tolerate deviation only while they are incomplete. Once completed, they absorb or erase deviations without acknowledgement. The Italian rifle episode is valuable precisely because it is so difficult to isolate. It survives only as an inference drawn from changes in engagement tempo, ammunition expenditure, and doctrinal emphasis. It is visible not in anecdotes, but in the disappearance of the conditions that made it matter. By the time Allied forces moved beyond Italy, the infantry fight had been redefined. Contact was initiated by planned fires, sustained by overlapping weapons, and resolved by maneuver under cover rather than by individual shot placement. The rifle remained in every soldier's hands, unchanged in form, but fundamentally altered in role. It was no longer the lever that moved events. It was the filler that maintained pressure while larger mechanisms turned. This redefinition did not require formal acknowledgement because it aligned with pressures already acting on the institution. By 1945, infantry battalions were evaluated less on marksmanship scores and more on their ability to maintain cohesion under fire, measured through communication continuity, casualty evacuation timing, and ammunition redistribution during movement. These metrics reflected a battlefield where individual weapon handling had diminishing marginal impact once contact density exceeded a certain threshold. The technical limiter was no longer aim, but endurance within a coordinated system. Evidence of this shift appears in the way failures were analyzed. After-action critiques increasingly attributed setbacks to breakdowns in coordination rather than to deficiencies in shooting skill. Delays measured in tens of seconds, lost messages, misaligned support, stalled movement, produced outcomes more severe than any individual firing error. In that environment, a 0.3 to 0.5 s advantage in sight acquisition could not compensate for a 20 to 30 s lapse in synchronization. The scale of causality had changed. Italian operations also influenced how terrain was conceptualized in planning. Rather than treating elevation and enclosure as variables affecting individual engagement, planners began to treat them as constraints shaping fire lanes and support placement. Maps were annotated not only with contours, but with expected reaction times and coverage overlaps. The rifleman's view was abstracted into a node within a spatial temporal model. Once abstraction reached that level, individual technique ceased to be a meaningful planning input. German defensive doctrine, under pressure from material shortages, converged towards similar abstractions. With fewer experienced marksmen available, reliance shifted to delaying actions, timed against Allied logistical rhythms. The goal was no longer to win the initial exchange, but to impose friction on the attacker's schedule. Under those conditions, the opening seconds of contact lost strategic relevance. What mattered was how long pressure could be sustained before withdrawal became unavoidable. Again, the rifle's role narrowed. The Italian episode therefore illustrates a boundary condition in modern warfare. Below a certain density of fire and coordination, individual adaptations can influence outcomes. Above it, they cannot. That boundary is not fixed. It moves with technology, organization, and environment. In Italy, during 1943, early 1944, the boundary was briefly exposed. Soldiers sensed it intuitively and adjusted locally. The system responded later, at scale, by shifting resources and doctrine until the boundary moved out of reach of individual action. What remains unresolved, and largely unrecorded, is how many similar micro-adaptations were attempted and discarded without leaving any trace at all. Only those that intersected with a measurable shift in outcomes can be inferred after the fact. The improvised sight method is visible not because it was unique, but because it coincided with a broader transition already underway. It rode the edge of systemic change, then fell away once that change completed. In that sense, the narrative is not about a rifle or a trick. It is about the moment when a war crosses from one regime of causality to another. Italy marks such a crossing. The infantry fight ceased to be an aggregate of individual contests and became an expression of coordinated pressure applied through overlapping systems. Once that transformation took hold, the space for individual technical deviation collapsed, not by prohibition, but by irrelevance. The riflemen continued to fight, to aim, to fire, but the outcome of those actions was increasingly determined elsewhere, in supply columns measured in tons per day, in fire plans synchronized to the minute, and in command structures designed to absorb loss without losing tempo. The improvised adjustment belonged to a brief interval when those structures had not yet fully asserted control. When they did, the adjustment vanished, leaving behind only the trace of a system learning how to wage war at scale. When viewed at full historical scale, the Italian episode settles into its proper proportion. It does not stand as a revolution in infantry combat, nor as a footnote of eccentric improvisation. It marks a transition point in the industrialization of ground warfare, where the last residual influence of individual weapon handling yielded to systems designed to dominate time, space, and logistics simultaneously. Between 1942 and 1944, all major armies crossed this threshold at different speeds. Italy forced the crossing early. Terrain collapsed engagement distances to less than 100 m. Elevation differences of 20 to 40 m disrupted ballistic assumptions, and reaction windows shrank below 2s. Under those constraints, inherited doctrines optimized for deliberate rifle fire at 300 yards could not govern outcomes. Soldiers adapted locally because the system had not yet fully reconfigured itself. What followed was not doctrinal enlightenment, but systemic compensation. Automatic weapon density increased. Indirect fire planning matured into synchronized time-on-target patterns. Ammunition supply shifted from supporting marksmanship to sustaining suppression, measured in rounds per minute rather than hits per shot. Command emphasis moved toward tempo maintenance and coordination reliability, where delays of 30 to 60 s outweighed any improvement achievable at the individual level. By 1944 to 1945, this transformation was complete. Infantry combat was no longer an accumulation of individual firing solutions. It was an engineered process governed by throughput, redundancy, and synchronization. The rifle remained universal, but its function was subordinated. It filled gaps between machine guns, mortars, and artillery. It maintained pressure rather than initiating it. Precision survived mechanically, but lost causal primacy. In this context, the improvised sight method becomes legible as a symptom, not a solution. It existed because the war temporarily demanded something the system had not yet supplied. Once the system adjusted, through mass, coordination, and firepower, the symptom resolved itself without formal acknowledgement. No directive was required. The environment that gave the method relevance ceased to exist. This pattern recurs throughout modern warfare. Individual adaptations emerge where doctrine lags material reality. They persist only while scale has not yet erased variance. When systems mature, variance becomes noise, and noise is filtered out. What remains is not the memory of the adaptation, but the structural changes that made it unnecessary. Italy, therefore, matters not because it produced a new way of aiming a rifle, but because it revealed the precise moment when individual lethality stopped being the primary driver of infantry combat. After that point, wars were decided increasingly by the management of fire systems, logistics, and time rather than by the skill of isolated soldiers. No matter how capable, the rifleman did not disappear. He was absorbed. His actions continued to matter tactically, but their strategic weight diminished as warfare crossed into a regime where outcomes were shaped upstream by production schedules, training throughput, ammunition tonnage, and coordination under pressure. The battlefield became an extension of the factory and the timetable. Seen this way, the episode is neither heroic nor trivial. It is diagnostic. It shows how wars evolve not through single innovations, but through the quiet elimination of anything that cannot scale. The improvised adjustment did its work by exposing a mismatch. Once that mismatch was resolved, the adjustment vanished, leaving behind a more coherent, more impersonal, and more lethal system. One in which the fate of battles no longer hinged on how a single man aligned his sights, but on how entire organizations synchronized force across minutes, kilometers, and thousands of tons of material.